So welcome back, everyone. I see Claire there on Twitter begging me to take off the tie. It may well get to that point shortly. And thank you, Amanda, there on Twitter with her fab ice lolly. Glad she says she's having a fab time. So a treat now, as we have a selection of excellent practitioners to share their knowledge with us here today. This is our panel session titled Weaving Data Protection into the Fabric of Organizations. How can the ICO support DPOs in their role? So we'll meet our panel shortly. So we've got Lauren, Richmond, Martin, Andreas, Professor Yinka, and our chair, John, the Information Commissioner. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, panelists, for joining us. This is going to be a great session, and I'm so pleased that we're able to represent such a diverse collection of DPOs from Scotland, Ireland, from public sector and from the finance. You know, it's going to be really rich, I hope. And I'd like, when you first speak, if you could just introduce yourself briefly, your name, your job title. We're all but one data protection officers, and the organisation that you work with. And as an opener, I'm going to ask each of you to tell me what was the most unexpected data protection challenge that you faced. Now, I'm going to go in order of how you appear on my screen. And of course, you don't know. So that introduces just a little bit of tension and anxiety into it. But Lauren, I put you out of your misery first. How would you like to respond to that question for us? And just let us know where you're at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. What's your role there?
Rookie mistake, I was on mute there. Thanks, John. I'm the Data Protection Officer at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And in that role, I can't take full credit for it. I'm currently job sharing with my amazing job share partner, Joe Jones. So I do, you know, I think you all know what the DPO role involves. My most challenging, most unexpected data protection challenge, I think, would be in a previous role. So in 2017, I was offered and accepted a job at Macmillan Cancer Support as their first dedicated data protection employee. I knew that GDPR was coming in, but what I didn't know was happening was 1 week before I started in post, the ICO fined 13 charities, including Macmillan, for their fundraising practices and handling of donor data, which I think it's safe to say triggered a sector-wide crisis on top of incoming GDPR. And I would say that was my most unexpected data protection challenge and probably my most challenging data protection challenge.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm really interested in the job sharing. Is that a challenge for managing the DPO role? Do you have your own stuff that you deal with on your days, or do you hand off to your colleague and sort of just work seamlessly together? How does that work?
So it's still quite new. We've been job sharing for maybe 2-3 months now, and we're still negotiating, and we will be on a continuing basis, how we work best together and how it rolls. And yeah, we currently have a very fancy spreadsheet. I think everyone likes a fancy spreadsheet. We used to do our asset registers and our ROPAs on our spreadsheets. So we have a spreadsheet where we're updating each other and making sure we're all in the loop about what each of us are working on and what advice we've given when and where. But without wanting to take all of the time right at the beginning, I looked this morning at the new draft bill, and it was very exciting for me to see that where I won't talk about how the senior responsible person is sort of replacing the DPO role and my concerns with that. But what was really exciting was where it sets out the designation of the senior responsible person, it explicitly allows for the role to be shared, which is new. And I think that's really fantastic and really opens up the profession to a lot of people that might otherwise not be able or not wanted to have a job share.
Yeah, thank you. And it certainly introduces that flexibility, doesn't it? And that's something that we at the ICO have been trying to push also, to give businesses and organisations more flexibility in the way that they comply with their obligations. And I think that makes good sense, and fantastic to see that you've been doing it already, you're making it work, and people are going to be coming to you and asking for advice, I think. Next on my screen is Dr. Richmond Davies, but I think we're just going to stick with first names, if that's okay, Richmond. What about you? What's your most unexpected data protection challenge?
Well, I'm Richmond. I am the DPO and Head of Service in Public Health Scotland. We're quite a new, young organisation. We're part of the NHS in Scotland family, and we were formed on the 1st of April 2020 in lockdown. So I haven't seen most of my staff in Public Health Scotland because we were all working remotely. So challenge, this would have to be a COVID-19 related one. So here was a member of the public who I understand we do not provide direct patient care at all. We collect a lot of data and we publish statistics and we support research and that kind of thing. So a member of the public had been invited for their COVID-19 vaccination, but I believe the NHS organization that invited them used their old address, so they hadn't quite updated their records. And I understand lots of toing and froing occurred, and it was subsequently rectified. But nevertheless, I think this member of the public wanted to get to the bottom of why it wasn't rectified ASAP as soon as he changed home address. So somehow he found my official email address and contacted me to say, you know, he needed me to provide an explanation as to, you know, why this was the case. So I had to try to make sense to what he was asking, and I spent a lot of time providing a response to him to explain how the NHS is organized, and we're a national organization. We don't really provide direct patient care and that kind of thing. So he came back and the response was extremely profane. The language was not the best in the email, and I responded to him again, but this time it was a much shorter response. And again, the response was even filled with more profanities, I have to say. And then he subsequently emailed to say he had attempted to visit our office, and the people at reception and security prevented him from entering the building because he was trying to look for me to have a discussion about this thing because he wanted an answer. I was like, oh dear, because there's hardly anyone in our buildings, and we're all from working at home. And I realized I was spending too much time with this gentleman, just toing and froing and toing and froing. He was not clearly being reasonable. I explained to him his rights, and he could, you know, if he's not happy with what he's got so far, he could always get in touch with the ICO. And he didn't seem to be prepared to do that. It was to respond again to me. And so I had to pass him on to our complaints department. And I think that was the best thing I did, because I never heard from him again. The complaints department do have a process, how they manage complaints. I'm not involved in that, but I was exceedingly happy to have resolved that problem as far as I was concerned. So that was a challenge I had quite quickly earlier on in my role.
Thanks, Richmond. I think that's an experience we've all had, and it just goes to show that the skills you need as a data protection officer are wide and varied, and require often an understanding of sometimes mental health and yes, the ways in which people can lose perspective. And I've experienced the same thing, people guessing my email address and sending me stuff. I don't know how they guess it, because my email address is John E123 *** exclamation mark. But there you go. Thanks for that. I'm going to come back to you and ask a bit more about your experience with data protection and COVID in a minute. But Martin, what can you share about the data protection challenge that took you by surprise?
Thank you, John, and thank you for yourself and the ICO for the kind invite this morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Martin Fisher, Regulatory and Legal Officer for Northern Ireland with the Irish Legal Credit Unions. We're an all-Ireland body. which means we operate in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And I suppose what I wanted to try and start with this morning is a little bit of context to what credit unions are for those who might not know or have heard of them but don't really know anything more. So credit union is really a group of people connected by a common bond, which is normally based on the area they live in, could be the occupation they work in or the employer they work for. They save together and they lend to each other at a fair and reasonable rate of interest, which is capped by legislation. Any surplus income generated is returned to the members by way of dividend or an interest rebate on the money that they've paid as part of that loan, or is directed back into the credit union to improve services or given to the wider community. And so the money in the credit union always remains in the local community. In Northern Ireland, we have 87 credit unions affiliated to ourselves. They range in size, with the largest with over 30,000 members and 30 to 40 staff, open 6 days a week, to the smallest with a couple of hundred members, completely volunteer run and open only on, say, a Friday afternoon or Friday evening or Saturday morning. So you see we have kind of an entire spectrum of sizes and complexity. I suppose there's a couple of things I'd like to say about challenges. The unexpected or expected continues to be the dread every Friday afternoon, normally about 4:30, that there's going to be a data breach, or there has been a data breach, and trying to pull all your resources together to try and understand that and whether it's something that might be notifiable, etc. And we're quite lucky we have a really good backup service that's provided by our insurance providers, which has all the relevant experts in that regard. I suppose more substantially, credit unions are moving increasingly into an online and digital world. So one of the biggest challenges we're trying to deal with is trying to keep up to date with the emergence of new technologies being offered by our IT providers, understanding the advantages and disadvantages and the risks associated with those technologies. And then as a result, engaging and taking on those technologies and undertaking DPIAs in a way that understands and addresses those risks to make sure that the services that we're providing to our members can be compliant. That can be challenging as well as frustrating and complex, especially for some of our smaller credit unions who kind of, in some circumstances, lack the detailed understanding or experience in undertaking their DPIAs. And IT providers have a product or service that they believe is fit for purpose, but of course they're really coming at it from their perspective. So it's sometimes a challenge to find a balance between those solutions, which we know are really good and member facing, with our risk appetite and our understanding that the credit unions have. So that's kind of just some of my initial thoughts on that query, John.
Thanks, Martin. And I think you're absolutely right. Whatever discipline or skill or profession you bring to the role of data protection officer, you've got to go somewhere else for support, right? I mean, you're having to make complex assessments of IT innovations, and you also have to be across the law. As Richmond has told us, you need to be a psychologist as well, and a sort of lion tamer. So there's all these skills that you've got to either have or be able to access in order to discharge that function. And it's a really, I don't think I've ever met the data protection officer, or we used to call them privacy officers back home, who had all of those in one place. I'm going to move now to Andreas. Could you introduce Entain and let us know your role there and what the most unexpected data protection challenge you've faced has been?
Pleasure. So Entain is one of the world's largest gaming and sports betting operators. Many of you will know the UK brands Ladbrokes and Coral, but we also have other brands across Europe. So it's a pretty challenging organization in terms of distribution, in terms of the location we operate from. It's truly global, ranging from Australia, not New Zealand, but Australia on the one end, to the US and the Pacific region the other end. I'm the Chief Privacy and Group Data Protection Officer, look after all things data and privacy. I very often, much to my delight, get mixed up with the Chief Data Officer, Monica, which I very much like because I enjoy innovation. I enjoy the non-legal parts of the data challenge. So I encourage that clearly. My most unexpected challenge, in the sense unexpected item in the baggage area, was a discussion many moons ago, I should say, with the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL. I was in private practice and had a US client, tech client, sitting next to me. And the question I was asked is, why does your client need to transfer data out of France? And it was a hot and sweaty summer day, especially so for all of us. Somehow we got through, but luckily the world has moved on. Now we're discussing data transfer frameworks, although topics like data localization, for example, and on-soil processing are still very much on top of the agenda. So looking forward to discuss some of that in this session.
Thank you. So let's add international relations and comparative law to the skill mix required. Pravisa.
Hi, John. So yeah, my name is Pravisa Mohaveme and I work for Standard Chartered Bank. I'm the Deputy Group Data Protection Officer. So one of the challenges, John, that I would like to perhaps highlight for this forum is the fact that we have, we've got Group Privacy Standard, which to a large extent incorporates GDPR. So that's our, standard within which we operate. Bearing in mind the fact that Standard Chartered Bank is a multi-jurisdictional bank operating across 65 or more markets. I had underestimated the difficulties that having one standard, be it the golden standard, as we can refer to the GDPR, being implemented and deployed across the group. I remember having to deal with data breaches and trying to assess a data breach which spans across different jurisdictions who may not even have a data privacy law in place at all, trying to get that momentum whereby we have controls in place to make sure that the assessment is done and is done timely, and the reporting to the regulators, if necessary, is done also timely, was definitely a challenge that I had not foreseen before. So, yeah.
I bet, and I can imagine the sensation that you get when you're notified of that breach and the magnitude of the task ahead appears. And I wonder if you could just give us your reflection on that, Pravisa. Would you recommend that DPOs do some scenario planning for that inevitability? Some, role playing, getting prepared for what do we do if the worst happens?
Absolutely. So apart from having procedures in place, which not many people read, because one thing I've discovered, people tend not to want to read. One has to be proactively engaged in offering the right guidance, the right trainings, and, trying to foresee the case scenarios to a large extent, if possible, and try to repeat that regularly. And that's the only way that, might help us as DPOs be able to actually do our job properly, because we can't be responsible for the whole, data breach process. We need everyone on board. We need our colleagues to understand, first of all, the importance at what it is that we're looking at and the practical steps that they need to take. Because, when a data breach happens, time is critical, as we know. So we have to make sure that we know who to contact, what to do, where to log the, the breach, etc. Doesn't also help the fact that if you are spread, across the globe, there is a time zone difference as well. And that's always something that, poses a challenge, if you're sat in London and you've got to talk to your colleagues in Australia, for example.
Absolutely. Well, the best training in the country just dropped. So you can jump onto ico.org/training, find the data breach module, email it out to all your staff, and they'll be a little bit prepared at least. Thanks for that, Pravisa. Yinka, thanks for your patience. You're beaming in from the heart of Whitehall. Tell us about life in the Ministry of Justice, and to the extent that your professional integrity allows, something that has been your most unexpected data protection challenge.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Yinka Williams. I'm a Deputy Director and also the Data Protection Officer.
Yinka, can I just get you to pause for a moment? I'm sorry, we've got a little audio problem there. Can the team tell me which end that is at? So we can just get onto this straight away. Can we increase Yinka's audio volume? Could you just give me a 1, 2, 3, Yinka?
1, 2, 3.
That's better. That's good. Thank you. Sorry, take it from the top.
Okay, so I'm Yinka Williams. I'm a Deputy Director and also the Data Protection Officer at the Ministry of Justice. I think my biggest challenge as a data protection practitioner has been joining the civil service, joining the Ministry of Justice. I've come from the NHS, and I wasn't expecting there to be such a difference between public organisations. And I think the challenge has been the Ministry of Justice is massive. There's over 90,000 staff. There are 5 very big executive agencies, and there are about 30 additional organisations which fall under the MOJ umbrella. We're talking about data protection officer skills. I think being a chameleon perhaps is one of them, because each organisation has its own culture, has its own governance structure. They may or may not recognise the central data protection team as having expertise. And so what we had to do, I started in 2020, January 2020, just before the pandemic really kicked in. And the first challenge was resourcing the team to be able to deal with the task ahead of us. And then together, we really had to go on a charm offensive in a way that as a data protection practitioner, perhaps you wouldn't really expect to have to do. So as well as being the providing guidance, training, support, all of those things, we had to introduce a spark of joy as well, because people tend to be a bit gloomy when you start talking to them about data protection. So we had to be very friendly, very engaging, very collaborative, work alongside of our colleagues, and really demonstrate the value that could be had when we did things together. We introduced data protection at the start. And although I think the first year definitely was the most challenging of my professional career, the rewards now in the second going on to third year have been very, very encouraging. And I think that the whole team feels the same way. So that's my story.
Wonderful. Thank you. I wasn't sure whether you said you had to be a chameleon or a comedian in there. I guess either would help. But you know, you've also added salesperson to that list of job requirements, haven't you? I wonder if you could just comment briefly, Yinka. I mean, the Ministry of Justice is a rich source of data that others across the public service want to access and to use in terms of developing public policy. Sometimes people end up in the justice system because of failures of public policy, and you want to know what the pathway has been. How have you been able to respond to that? Have you found the data sharing code issued by the ICO of any assistance?
Okay, so if I start at the beginning, yes, lots of people, lots of organisations want to get access to our data, our rich data, and indeed the Ministry of Justice itself, the different executive agencies want to be able to use data, enabled to inform decision making and to improve outcomes. We have a data and analysis directorate whose entire function is around making data accessible, using data in a appropriate way in order to help inform. The data sharing code definitely has been of help to us, and we are at the moment engaged with some of our other government departments. The Home Office comes to mind in terms of developing some national guidance around sharing data for criminal justice purposes.
Thank you. I think we'll probably come back to that. I've got a series of questions here that I'm going to put to one principal interlocutor, and others can chime in if you think you've got something to contribute, and then I'll move on. The first one, I wanted to build on this idea that we've started to develop about the skill set necessary for a successful data protection officer. And I know that Richmond, I was in Scotland earlier in the year and talking with people in the health sector, and of course the pandemic created an enormous amount of activity. What were the challenges that you faced and the skills that you've needed as a data protection officer in the public health sector?
Yeah. So the public health sector is particularly challenging, and particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason why is because national policy on COVID-19 was changing sometimes on a weekly basis. So for us in Scotland, you've got the UK national policy at PM level, and then we've got the devolved Scottish government policy at that level, at that devolved level as well. These policies are changing week after week. So we would be engaged in a new information system or a new data collection measure, and DPIA has been written. And then I'm reviewing the DPIA. In the middle of reviewing the DPIA, the policy has changed. So which means there needs to be a new version of the DPIA. And this goes on, and this is just one. It could be 6 or 7 different information streams existing at that time that are all changing in response to the changing policy landscape. So one of my skills has been patience and listening skills. I have to be patient because I have to understand and accept that there were many unknowns in the early days of COVID-19. People were dying quite rapidly, and the figures were just going up day after day after day, and nobody knew all the answers. So which meant that data was one of the ways in which you could have a better understanding of what was going on. So having all these meetings, and some of these meetings were back-to-back virtual meetings all day, sometimes over the weekend as well. So I was always cited on the justification of purposes of processing, but accepting that things needed to happen quite rapidly because we were under emergency measures across the UK. I also had to be able to embrace change. So for example, we had to, in Scotland, the NHS had to develop a rapid DPIA, because we have a standardized DPIA templates that we use in the NHS in Scotland. But to cope with COVID-19, all of us had to come together to create a slightly shortened version of the normal DPIA, which was a temporary measure to tide us over, because there were so many things that were happening on a daily basis. So that kind of change, I had to be receptive to that kind of change, because this was the landscape that we found ourselves in. The other one is attention to detail and being able to read enormous amounts of information rapidly, forming a view and providing written advice. And this was a huge challenge. The numbers of DPIAs rocketed on a weekly basis. And as they're living documents, they are all subject to change all the time. The other one is communication skills, being able to be bold, be assertive, be knowledgeable, and say what my advice is, in writing, and get people to trust that advice, and and providing new advice every week as time went on. And that is tied on with being able to work as part of a group, because some of these meetings had in excess of 80 to 100 people. The daily meetings that we had, contributions from different parts of the NHS and the Scottish government as well. And sometimes we had some visitors who would come in and out, and that included clinicians as well, who were seeing, what was happening at the coal face. So being able to make decisions collectively as a group and being able to understand where we were is another skill as well. And tied in with the leadership and interpersonal skills, interacting with all sorts of people within the organization and ensuring that the advice I give is not falling on deaf ears. And of course, business experience. I had to, because I'd had some experience working in other parts of the organization while I was in other parts of the NHS. So I had a clear understanding of the types of data that we interacted with in healthcare, and the ones that were special category and the ones that were not, and that kind of thing. And I understood that the NHS had really clearly robust information systems with security firewall around them and that kind of thing, because of the sanctity of NHS data. So I did understand that, but there were some challenges such as, we were working with IT experts who would do what they call wireframe diagrams. So they were like data architects, because the information flows were so complex. There were many controllers, some were separate controllers, some were joint controllers, and to understand the flow of data from A to B to C to D, and where we came in as an organization and lines of responsibilities. So that exercised my knowledge and skills as well. And of course, the main thing is an understanding of data protection law, being able to understand clearly all the principles and the various articles, etc. So that was my experience.
Thanks,
it wasn't easy.
Thanks, Richmond. Sorry, you froze for a minute there, and I thought you'd pause, so
no,
I jumped in. I hope I haven't cut across.
No.
But that's wonderful. Thank you. So, I mean, patience and listening, attention to detail and communication skill, and ability to process vast amounts of data yourself. And I think I've just noted what you've described as agility and adaptability. One of the things I think that occurred to me during the pandemic is that sometimes decisions needed to be made very quickly with incomplete information. And you've described, I think, that scenario. It's also important, of course, to review some of those decisions when you have the luxury of time, and to go back and say, well, we did this in urgency. Now that we have a bit more time, do we need to revise that? Look, thank you for that. That's been helpful. Professor, you and I talked earlier in the year with some of your UK finance colleagues, and I just wanted to check in with you if I could, especially given your comments about the challenges of operating in multiple jurisdictions, how the finance sector continues, is preparing and responding to data law reform in the United Kingdom.
Well, John, firstly, I would like to really thank you for your proactive approach in being open to meet through the listening series with the financial sector, and to seek our views as to the issues that we as an industry are struggling with, especially in the face of the ever-changing regulatory landscape in the field of data protection. We were fortunate enough as an industry through the UK Finance, which is an industry body, to be able to participate in the consultation process and have bilateral discussions and share feedback with the representatives from the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, who were leading this consultation. So how is the industry responding to data law reforms? And especially how is an organisation such as the one I work for dealing with such change? I must say that it has not been an easy journey for sure. Since the onset of the GDPR, the financial sector has continuously been trying to implement the regulatory requirements, resulting not only, out of the GDPR, but also dealing with the aftermath of, Schrems 2, the new SECs. But we also have things coming outside of the UK, for example, PRA's supervisory statement, numerous guidelines issued by the EDPB. So it feels like we're constantly in this wheel of having to comply without even first finishing fully what we were trying to do in the first place in terms of, pushing through GDPR. There's already something coming our way. One thing that obviously we have kind of struggled with, of course, is the resources. The cost of implementation have been high, and I'm sure that goes for other sectors as well. So whilst we yet to see the final text of the law once it gets approved, although we know that just yesterday, for the first time, we saw the draft bill being, placed in front of the House of Commons, for larger and multi-jurisdictional organizations which have implemented the GDPR, I believe that the new law, dare I say it, is not expected to bring major change, especially since what we've seen, the divergence from the UK GDPR is not so material. The reforms, we know, aim to foster flexible, dynamic, risk-based privacy management approach that organizations can take based on the types of processing that happens and their complexity. And this, I believe, allows to move away from seeing, privacy as merely a, compliance box ticking exercise. It's still to be seen, though, for example, how the requirements to have a privacy management program will interact with the ICO's fantastic but also broad accountability principle. So we believe that no doubt this framework will be the benchmark against which such a program would be assessed. So I guess the industry will expect further clarification on this. Now, some organizations may wish to take advantage of the flexibility that the new reforms will provide, where removing some of the burdens such as, preparing, maintaining ROPA and DPIAs, appointment of DPOs, etc., was back then a requirement. However, even with the new, even though some of the requirements, of the UK GDPR may be formally removed, as we've seen with the new bill, organizations are still required to maintain many of the many of the GDPR principles which have been implemented. For example, we still need to conduct assessment of high-risk processing, the former DPIAs now. We still need to have a personal data inventory, which is essentially the ROPA. And as one of the former speakers said, we also need to, appoint a senior responsible individual in charge of data protection. Therefore, I believe that large organizations who've implemented the GDPR are well placed to deal with the legal reforms, taking advantage of the flexibility provided by the new reforms. One important topic, though, that the financial industry finds a challenge in particular is the international transfer of personal data. As I said earlier, we're still struggling with the aftermath of Schrems II and also the remediation following the SCCs. The new reforms, we are aware, allow for a more risk-based approach, both in terms of the assessment of the adequacy of the third countries and also the appropriateness of safeguards. However, organizations are struggling to assess the transfers of personal data, given the granularity, the assessment, limited access to resources, and also limited guidance on this. Therefore, the financial sector is yet to find out what the actual law, once published, will provide in terms of clarity and support when it comes to international transfer of data, and would definitely welcome further guidance on this. And I think, lastly, to just conclude, the industry also expects practical tools to be put in place, and perhaps they require more guidance from the ICO, because these tools will help the industry assess in a more systematic way international transfers of personal data and reduce risks.
Thanks, Pravisa. I really appreciate that. And it harks back to the title of this session, how can the ICO support DPOs in their role? And what I've heard you say is that for you, you've described an experience that's quite familiar to me. I used the phrase, my first few months in the job were like drinking from the fire hose. And you've just got this stuff coming down the pipe at you all the time. And that tells me a message about how we support you with timely, appropriate sector-specific materials to assist and understand the obligations. Just for the audience, we've thrown the invitation open to any panelist who wants to make a contribution to something or to react to something that one of the panelists has said, and Lauren is taking up that opportunity. So Lauren, what are you reacting to from Pravisa's presentation? I think you're still on mute, Lauren.
There we go, twice in one session. That's extremely embarrassing. I wanted to say, yeah, Pravisa's point that the fundamental, that there's not really huge fundamental changes in the new legislation if you've got that good information governance framework and that foundation within your organization and that buy-in, and you've got those big organizations that can put that resource into it. And I think that although largely I agree, my concern is with those slightly smaller organizations who will take advantage, who are able to take advantage of the flexibility that the proposed bill offers in terms of, not requiring the senior responsible owner to have any data protection expertise. I think that's a huge risk. And for, I think it said in relation to the records of processing and the new requirement around that, there was a reference to the organisation being able to judge what an appropriate, how it deems appropriate to comply with this requirement, which seemed very woolly and very open to organisations who don't want to comply and don't have that buy-in and don't have that expertise or that impetus to take it seriously, to kind of opt out of a lot of that good work that has happened over the past 4 years, which GDPR coming in really helped drive and really gave the push and the impetus to organisations and senior leadership to take seriously. So I think that there are certainly a lot of risks there. So I think I agree that for the large organisation to have good practice and good accountability frameworks in place already, things shouldn't change too dramatically in your day-to-day, but the risk that things slip, or the risk that other organisations that might be smaller end up with a much less good regime and much less protections for individuals is quite significant.
Thanks, Lauren. And I think it's timely to point that out. There is a cop, though, patrolling those kinds of decisions. I think that what it does is it allows organisations to take a proportional approach based on the kind of data that they've got and they're using, and to say that, one size doesn't necessarily fit all. So I'm a little more optimistic about the benefits that sort of flexibility will offer, and the potential for that flexibility to be abused. But Martin has another perspective as well, I think, on this.
Yes, thanks, John. I was just really building on what Lauren and Pravisa was saying there in terms of the legislation. And I think Lauren's right. A lot of good work has happened in the last 4 years. And I suppose I sensed a frustration last night when I was looking towards the bill that really the bill's amending the Data Protection Act, which I think in a sense it becomes even more complex for practitioners to interpret and analyse, and I just have a fear that it then increases the barriers for people to understand it and for it to be communicated. And obviously, what Richmond was saying there about the ability to communicate effectively in plain English is in a manner where everyone from the internal side, from the cleaner, he comes in once a day, up to the CEO and the board of directors, and then externally to your customers or your members. I think that it just becomes much more complex. It already is complex. I fear it's just becoming even more complex with the amendments that came out yesterday.
Thanks, Martin. Look, that's definitely the challenge that we've got, and this is my commitment to you. We've undertaken in ICO 25 to provide appropriate materials and to meet industry where it is. And I think that includes sort of layered products and resources to meet the needs both of the technical expert and the cleaner who comes in once a day, and the chief executive who's got to be across a whole range of things. That's the challenge for us. But, what I want to do, and my philosophy is, as regulator, I'm going to spend that money to create those products for you. We do it once at the centre, and it is used tens of thousands of times out there in the economy, saving and preventing organisations from spending money on products that ought to really come in to support the legislation. Pravisa, you wanted to come back, and then I think we'll move on to the next question, which I'm going to invite Andreas to provide some reflections on.
Sure. Thank you, John. Since we're talking about the draft bill, I just had a question for you, really. Do you think that legal reforms contained in the draft bill, which foresee changes to the ICO, would in any way impact the ICO strategy, which was set out last week at all? What would your view on that be?
One of the things, thanks for the question, because I saw some commentary after the ICO 25 came out that, we are we are banking on legislation which hasn't been passed in order to achieve this. It's completely untrue. There's nothing in ICO 25 plan which depends on law reform. Everything we've said we can do in there, we want to do in there, we can do without the legislation. What the legislation will do in one particular part is give us greater flexibility about where we allocate our resources, greater flexibility to choose which complaints we investigate. At the moment, up to about 65% or 70% of our capacity is taken up by demand-driven work that we have no discretion over. It comes in, we've got to take it. And we don't know whether all of that has equal impact on society, on individuals, and whether it improves anybody's lives. And so giving us that greater discretion to allocate our resources where it will have the greatest effect for the greatest number of people is going to be a welcome reform. But there's a lot we can do without that tweak. Thank you for that. That was a really interesting discussion, and we've touched on the kinds of skills that we need in data protection in a DPO. We've talked about law reform. I want to talk about some of the challenges and the work that we do in the sandbox, this walking alongside innovators. Andreas, we've talked a lot about trying to help vulnerable communities, and I think you've been also treading that balance with maintaining a perfectly legitimate and legal business that nonetheless can present a harmful side to vulnerable individuals. And you've worked with us in the sandbox on the single customer view project. Could you share some of your experiences of that and some of the challenges that you face with that sort of work?
Yes, sure. My pleasure. So I think you're right, John, to say that it's a huge focus, including in the gaming and sports betting industry, as well as amongst regulators, parliament, government, to ensure vulnerable customers are protected. And there's as you know, there's a review of the UK Gambling Act legislation, which was brought in about 20 years ago, 17 years ago, give or take, in order to make the sector viable as a commercial enterprise. Clearly, lots of things have happened since then. The online revolution, we have Facebook, we have Apple, we have Google. The data economy is thriving. So clearly, COVID has nothing but accelerated that process. So clearly, there is a concern also that not everyone will sort of take the advantage of that, and that some people who are particularly vulnerable obviously get caught up in this. And it's our job, frankly, I absolutely agree with that, to help get this right, and to create conditions for people to still enjoy products like gaming and sports betting in a responsible way. It's also fair to say that the industry hasn't always been fully focused on these kind of issues, and it's fortunate now that due to societal changes, the use of more modern platforms, online technology, and also a sort of rebalancing, if you like, of the values of society, we're now looking into these issues in more detail. And I think that's the Sandbox project is an iteration or is a focal point for these kind of efforts. It provides us with a unique opportunity to look at solutions to keep people safe when they're playing online in particular. And data sharing is certainly one of the ways we're exploring in order to do that. Operators have traditionally focused on getting their own process. Certainly the leading operators have focused on getting their own processes right, making sure that that the individual is being able to enjoy gaming responsibly. But clearly we've discovered that there are a number of players who also gamble with other operators. And that kind of aspect has been a blind spot for some time. So this project enables us to look more holistically at how gamblers basically look at and enjoy and use our products. We're grateful for the opportunity. It raises some very interesting legal challenges. The Sandbox team has been extremely helpful, identify and helps manage us these issues. As you can imagine, even before you get to the legal challenges, having several operators with different commercial interests involved acting through an organization like the Betting and Gaming Council, trying to solve a conundrum which has been with us for some time, is not an easy job, and throws up some technical issues as well. It exposes like in other industries, the fact that not everyone is created equal. Some organizations have these capabilities, have developed them. Others are not very good at data processing, don't have the process in place. And bridging that divide is one of the key challenges for this particular project. The particular aspect of it is the lawful basis for the data sharing, which we spent many a day discussing what's right, because what we don't want to do is create the assumption that everyone has a gambling problem. It's very rare, luckily, that this is the case. So we want to focus on that very discrete set of problem gamblers rather than on having the Queen and horse races basically being part of a national register of gamblers, which would probably not be very welcomed, certainly not by the Queen. And that's the kind of framework we're operating in, and I think we made some very good progress there. And we're not done yet, but the sandbox has really helped to supercharge these efforts.
Thanks, Andreas. I saw Pravisa's hand was up, but that might have been a legacy hand or an old hand.
That's right, John. Sorry, I just removed it.
That's all right. And I missed your note in the chat. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to move on straight away without reacting to Andreas. I'm really pleased to hear that the sandbox was an effective way of navigating some of those tensions and challenges between those different parties and responsibilities. And at the heart of what you said, I think, was the complexity of proportionality. Sometimes, but I want to make sure everybody gets the chance to have the contribution that they've prepared for. And Yinka, I'm going to move to you now and to talk about the importance of networking, because we met, you and I and your colleagues at the government DPOs earlier in the year, and I wondered if you could just share a little bit of information about that network and whether there's more mileage in sharing expertise to cut down on your workload. What are the benefits from coming together in a grouping like that and sharing experience?
Thanks, John. So the group was convened in 2018, and I think it was in response to the new legislation coming into effect. It operates mainly by consensus, so it doesn't have any formal governance structure or formal reporting lines, but it's very helpful in the sense we meet once a month as practitioners. We discuss whatever issues or challenges we're facing in our respective departments, and it's a safe space within which we can work out thorny issues or problematic experiences. But I think one of the things we're mindful of is that we would like to be more heavy hitting. We'd like to leverage that expertise from all the different departments, all the different experiences, that the richness of corporate memory. There is a real opportunity now, and I noticed there will be a senior leadership group. The government has committed to that, I think, when you met with them. And I think one of the ways in which you could help us, John, is to see if we can establish some formal reporting lines from that forum into that senior leadership group, because there is the will. And I think if we have those formal arrangements in place, then that will help to embed, distill, make it a little easier to have those data protection conversations, because it will just be something we do rather than something we have to add into the discussion. There is some work going on. So the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Work and Pensions have worked together on training offerings. We've shared our expertise. And additionally, we've worked Ministry of Justice with Home Office on, as I've mentioned before, data sharing, etc. But all of those things have been quite informal. It's just based on relationships, goodwill, as opposed to a commitment across the perm secretaries that we will work together in order to improve data protection compliance.
Thanks, Yinka. That's really interesting, and I take that challenge. And that cross-Whitehall work leadership board is in its infancy, but I think formalising a relationship with your group could be really valuable. Does anybody else have any ideas about how the ICO could play a role in bringing DPOs together? Is it something that you'd like to, or do you have your own networks and portals and the like already? Richmond.
Yes, so in Scotland, we do have a DPO forum that comprises DPOs in the NHS. So we do meet, I think it's once a month, and we support, because sometimes the job of the DPO could be a tad lonely, and you do require some support to run things past other colleagues and that kind of thing. So we do meet once a month. We share challenges, we brainstorm, and we have another group known as the IG Leads group, which is a slightly more expanded group of other people who work in the whole IG sphere. And we do have external visitors attending from time to time, such as the Scotland office of the ICO, because the ICO do have a small, office in Edinburgh, and they could be invited from time to time.
Small but perfectly formed.
Absolutely, indeed. They could be invited from time to time to give us some advice or some latest developments and that kind of thing. So that's how we work. Yeah.
Thanks, Richmond. Lauren.
Thanks, John. So you asked what ICOs could do to help link up DPOs and bring them together. And I think for me, we've talked about being a chameleon and having to do all sorts of different tasks. I think the one task that I most dislike doing, and there's not a lot of them, is reviewing page after page of terms of conditions for online services or online products, especially the ones that are free, to risk assess them for the organisation. And normally you flag some risks and then you end up looking at the next tool along and there are risks there. And what I would love to see is like a Google reviews from DP professionals for these kind of services and products. So we don't all need to review these terms and conditions and these data protection policies and these privacy notices from these products and services, but actually we can do it once, twice, 3 times, get people's comments, and then we have a resource to pull from as a starting point instead of reinventing that wheel and using a lot of time and resource to do that detailed review.
Brilliant. Couldn't agree more. I mean, I wonder if you added up the number of data protection officers and the number of hours they spent looking at the Slack terms and conditions, for example, during the pandemic, and what efficiencies could have been gained, what money could have been saved if there was a central repository so we were able to learn from that. Fabulous suggestion, Lauren. It's something that I've been working on and talking with the team about, getting something along those lines. So really appreciate that support. I want to move to Martin and talk about sort of cross-border work and ICO interactions. And of course, there is a border in Ireland. We've been hearing a lot about it lately. I was in Belfast recently with our team there, and I was, it just didn't occur to me the complexities of the cross-border work there. And you must be working closely with the DPO in Dublin as well as with our office in Belfast. Can you tell us how you've worked with the ICO and the unique challenges that you face operating in that environment where you've got a foot in each jurisdiction in a sense?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, as an All-Ireland organisation, we have feet in both jurisdictions. So we do have a really positive relationship with the Northern Ireland office, and that stretches back many years. I suppose in recent years and with new staff and COVID, we've had to rekindle that relationship again. But the Northern Ireland manager, Caroline, and her team have recently given some of their time to us for a summer webinar update, along with a question and answer session, and we're hopeful that they're going to do some more deep dives for us later in the autumn or into 2023, looking in specific areas, for instance, direct marketing or PECR and international transfers. And I suppose the addendums and the guidance that have been talked about this morning will be really useful in that context. While we're a financial organisation, we don't have the physical or financial resources or capacity of the banks, so we're probably having to rely on yourselves in the ICO in more ways than possibly other organisations, and I think that's worked positively for us in Northern Ireland. Brexit has been difficult. There's no two ways about it for us as an all-Ireland organisation, and anticipating the scenarios that might come out of that has been frustrating, as I'm sure it has been for a lot of organisations, to try and prepare for the different scenarios and options. we've had to look at our data flows back and forth between the UK and Irish jurisdictions, and we've had to keep a watching eye on the events and the negotiations. I think you're right. The personal data flows between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland were probably overlooked as in their entirety. As there's an enormous amount of data flows that go on a daily basis as people live on both sides of the border, they work on both sides of the border, they go to school on both sides of the border, they might take advantage of health hospitals on both sides of the border. So there's an enormous amount of data flows in that regard. And some of our credit unions are based on the border, so they've had to understand the extent to which the services are being offered in either jurisdiction, and whether that triggered the offering of goods or services and the related obligations around that. We're also a trade and representative body, but we're also a service provider, so we've had to understand our data flows, that the information could flow to the Republic of Ireland from the UK as a result of the UK's adequacy decision. But there was some doubt at various stages throughout whether we would be able to send the data back to Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland. That's obviously without an adequacy decision. To that end, we had to set up and issue standard contractual clauses with our credit unions, and our credit unions had to review their own internal service providers as well to understand whether additional standard contractuals were needed. That was a lot of, I suppose, administrative work that had to be undertaken by what in the main are small volunteer organisations. Obviously, with the adequacy decision, that's not needed anymore, but it may be something we need to revisit in coming years, as depending on the route that the UK takes with its data protection reform journey. In terms of, I suppose, working in the future, we have a good relationship with the NI office. We recently held that NI session with the ICO for our credit unions, but we also held a separate session with our Republic of Ireland regulator, the Data Protection Commissioner. And I suppose we have been thinking of potentially doing a combined session for both jurisdictions with both regulators, and I think there would be merits in doing that. And I think it would be really interesting, because I think it would show some of the symmetries in place as well as the possible differences as to how the regulators approach their supervision, and I think it would be a good and positive experience for all. So it's something that we'll maybe touch base with the Northern Ireland team in the future to try and understand whether that might be possible. So that's
thanks, Martin. Really timely observations and really important. Just by coincidence, last week I signed an MOU with the Irish Data Protection Commission. So, we've recognised the importance of establishing really clear, formal modes of cooperation and collaboration. And I think that hopefully you'll start to see the impact of that. I'd be interested in finding what else you think I could be doing at the ICO to support international data flows, even though it's not really our responsibility to enable, to advise on the jurisdictions, other jurisdictions that you may be operating in. So there's some complexity there, and I see Andreas has a hand up, but I'm going to just put you on hold for a minute, Andreas, because I would like to hear from Lauren at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, just to think about the support for the DPO role and organisational values. I mean, EHCR obviously is a values-led organisation that has got people focused on really important issues, and particularly in vulnerable communities. And how do you build that internal support to achieve in-house data protection support that furthers the goal of your organisation, Lauren?
Thanks, John. So I've always worked for values-based organisations, which means that there's a culture which is based around core principles and beliefs that everyone that works there holds, and that shapes the organisation's identity and feeds into their purpose. And I mean, like Yinka said, moving from the NHS to the Ministry of Justice, culture can vary hugely even within value-based organisations, and I've seen that working across the EHRC, Macmillan Cancer Support, the NHS, it's all been very different. But what has been the same is that you're working with really, really passionate people who are trying to make people's lives better. And I think that means you have to be passionate yourself. You can't get away with being boring, and you have to have a strong understanding of what your organization's core purpose is and how you can link data protection to that purpose and communicate why data protection matters in terms of the kind of actual real life negative or backwards impact that it could have on the very individuals that you're looking to support. And I think that I've probably got a slightly easier job of that than other organizations and other DPOs here. Because at EHRC, we have a mandate to ensure compliance with Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to privacy. And where there's a breach of the right to privacy, there's almost always a breach or non-compliance with data protection legislation that sits behind it. So I think that's a much easier link to make. And at the Commission, we now have a strategic aim around artificial intelligence and new technologies. And we're doing lots of really interesting work in this area, which I know Martial Bou, our CEO, talked about in his speech earlier today. So that all adds weight to the internal data protection programme. And data protection legislation ultimately exists to protect individuals in the same way that human rights and equality legislation does. When our personal or special category data is out there, we all become vulnerable in different ways. So when you work for a values-based organisation, it's just a much easier link to make. And it's so important that you make that link, even if it doesn't directly relate to the day-to-day compliance piece that you're working on in that moment. So whenever I talk about internal processing, risks, practices, I link in real life examples of where when these things have gone wrong, like not following your retention schedule, for example, it has led to a breach in the right to privacy. So that it has makes it really relevant to your colleagues and helps them see the importance of the day-to-day compliance work within in relation to their overall goal and the organisation's overall purpose. But I would say that there is a risk in values-based organisations of a culture where people, and this isn't the case at the EHRC, I should say, but a culture where people feel that because they're doing something for good, they feel that they have a legitimate justification for any processing that they want to do for that overarching good or altruistic purpose. And in some circumstances, that can make it our job very difficult to flag those risks in a positive way and not be seen as producing barriers. And I would say it's so important not to put up those barriers and to not get a reputation for saying no, but to see your job as to facilitate the business, not your own agenda for compliance or your DPO tasks. That should sit behind, but be genuinely interested in people's projects and the works that they're doing, work for an organisation that you genuinely really care about and that you're really interested about, or that in some way gets your geeky self going. And that's not your data protection geeky self, but your other geeky selves, you know. And then I guess all sort of feeding into this will be training. I think, you know, this is possibly the most important and powerful engagement tool that we have. So I would say never stop doing that in-person training, that face-to-face training, keep it unique, interesting, relevant, personable. If you're losing the audience, look at how you can get them back, look at how you can improve the session for next time, and really get people interested and to care about your field and link that to the organisation's purpose and their work. So I think overall it's that passion and that energy that's going to get people to embed data protection in their work and support your organisation's goals.
Excellent, thank you. Well, it sounds like you're pushing against an open door at your organisation, and it's great that you have that support. But I do think that's a very legitimate sort of warning call there, that sometimes that sense of mission can lead to not a cavalier, but a sense of automatic license. What we're doing is so important that we've got to, you know, we can't let this stuff get in the way. Thank you for that, Lauren. Appreciate it. I will, in our last couple of minutes, throw to Andreas. It might not be linked to the topic that Lauren was speaking on, but let's take that anyway. And if anybody else wants to indicate a willingness to offer a closing remark, just light up your hand. Andreas.
Sure. I just wanted to finish, by the way, great discussion. Training has always been one of my passions, and it's basically the vehicle that gets the organization, if done in the right way, excited and highlights not just the compliance aspects, but the opportunities that good data management can actually bring, differentiating themselves from competitors, etc., etc. Anyway, the point I wanted to touch on was how can the ICO further have a voice in the international acquire of, how do we solve the data transfer conundrum? I mean, much has been said and written and spoken about transatlantic data flows, which seems to be the sort of linchpin of the discussion. But I mean, you had experience how Asia Pacific is doing it, the APEC cross-border data transfer framework, the privacy rules. So that lends a different perspective. I think the reason why organizations tend to pivot to GDPR is not because it's the best framework, but it's because of the Brussels effect. Why would you want to replicate different rules in different cultures when you're a company operating with the same business operations, the same business standards across the globe? And I think that's really what certainly the international community frustrates a lot, that it's all done with a very good intention, but having these deviations doesn't really help anyone in the practice. But I think you personally, coming from New Zealand, the other corner of the globe, and having seen other frameworks operating, can hopefully convince our European counterparts that some change may be actually a good thing, and help to sort of raise that framework to an even better level than it is at the moment and modernize it further.
Thank you. Well, that's a great note to end on. I think that there is, potential for us to go our own way, as I said in my opening remarks, and for us to do that in a way which is respectful of and recognizing other approaches to achieve the same goals. This has been a really rich and illuminating conversation amongst deeply experienced practitioners from a wide range of perspectives. And I can't overstate the value of this to our audience, who may be familiar with one element of the panel or another, but have had a really rich exposure now to a depth of knowledge and experience that justifies the registration fee alone. So thank you all my panelists for giving up your time and for sweltering in front of your computers. I need to release you all for lunch now. Really appreciate your contributions, and I'm sure the audience is out there holding their ice lollies in one hand and clapping at the same time. So hopefully they won't get melted sugary stuff everywhere. Anyway, I should shut up. Thank you so much. See you again.
Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Am I working now? Yeah, brilliant. Apologies there. Well, I just wanted to say thank you again to our fantastic panelists for their time and their great stories. I can see some tweets from delegates who've enjoyed that session. We've got some comments here on how hard the role of the DPO is and the need for the ICO to show leadership, comments on diversity, comments on welcoming discussions around job sharing, and people recognising the importance of patience to be a good DPO. That session was absolutely fascinating. Across the ICO, we've welcomed the opportunity to meet with so many practitioners throughout the listening tour this year, and it's really great to hear that insight and have a real focus group of ideas on this panel today. So please do look at the agenda to see the range of practical seminars going on through the coming hours. There are a great range of options to choose from and opportunities for questions and answers. Thank you very much for your attendance so far this morning. Keep the conversation going on our meeting hub, which is open today until 4:30. Keep the comments coming in on Twitter with the hashtag DPPC 2022. And please watch out for an email with the survey from our events team that will come to you in the next couple of days. Please do fill that in. So I've been your budget Richard Madeley today. It's been a pleasure talking to you this morning. I can take my tie off now. Stay cool, stay safe, and please come back this afternoon to enjoy the rest of the programme. Thank you very much.